Joining us now is Mark Ames. He's a senior editor at Pando Daily. Mark, how you doing?
Good. How you doing?
I'm doing well, man. Glad to get you on
Good.
the phone.
Thanks
Uh,
for having me on.
it's a pleasure. So let's get to this. You have been really aggressively reporting in Pando for the past couple of months. I think the first piece you came out with was several months ago on basically a price fixing cartel in Silicon Valley that implicated pretty much every major name you could think of. Not all, but most: Apple, Google, eBay, Adobe, basically including together to keep down the wages of engineers. And now there's a little bit, I would say a little bit, the New York Times has picked up on it. And there's some new news on the case. But before we get to that, will you just explain the outlines of how this cartel got started and what and who was involved and what they were doing, basically?
Sure. The actual early kernel of this basically wage theft cartel goes back to the mid '80s. George Lucas. It begins with George Lucas, as I wrote. He was the Obi-Wan Kenobi of this whole thing.
Already, it's a good story. Go ahead.
Exactly. A long time ago. So when Steve Jobs took over Pixar, which is really spun off, just sort of the computer animation division of Lucasfilm, when it was spun off from Lucasfilm, Jobs and another executive from Lucasfilm, and then George Lucas himself, agreed that they would not poach or recruit each other's employees without talking to each other first, explicitly because doing so would it would mean competing for these workers, and that would mean driving up their wages. And as Lucas said, my margins can't handle paying them better, basically. All these guys are filthy rich, so it's all pretty disgusting. Anyway, that planted the seed in Jobs' head back in the mid '80s.
Right.
And so fast forward to 2005, and there's another huge Silicon Valley tech industry boom, especially after Google's IPO the year before. And suddenly wages for computer engineers, programmers, skilled tech workers start soaring through the roof. In 2005 may have seen the sort of strongest upward pressure on tech wages maybe in the history of the industry.
Right.
And right away, Steve Jobs goes to Google, which is the hottest company that year, and basically says, all right, guys, I hear you're recruiting our guys, and it's driving up our wages and causing us problems. Here's the deal. Either we can go to war, and with Apple, going to war generally means filing all kinds of patent infringement suits. And, Apple just has such massive, deep pockets that they can really cost you a lot of money with these lawsuits. So he said, either we go to war, or you agree with me right now that neither of us are going to recruit each other's employees. And Sergey Brin, Eric Schmidt, these guys are kind of terrified of Jobs. Jobs is clearly a sociopath on a different order even from the rest of them. And so they agree immediately. And they figure eventually really it's in their interest as well, because they'd rather also not pay their employees more if they can get away with it.
Right.
So they formed the core of it, and over the next months and then a couple of years, they rope in all kinds of other companies. And the thing is, this is where, these incestuous boards of directors and their relationships really do matter. I mean, we don't, those of us on the outside who haven't been in boards of directors meetings, we don't really know why it's wrong. We know it's wrong. Well, these agreements were all worked out between the CEOs, who all sat on each other's boards, and or guys who are in the middle. So Bill Campbell, who was the chairman of Intuit at the time, he was also on the board of directors at Apple. He was a senior advisor to Google. He was the personal coach to Eric Schmidt and took regular Sunday walks with Steve Jobs. And he arranged a lot of these agreements as well. And they all agreed not to cold call or recruit each other's employees. And what the Department of Justice Antitrust Division and, economists and common sense says is obviously this was, the effect of this was to suppress wages.
Absolutely.
And yeah.
Yeah, no. I mean, this is fascinating, like the range and depth of it, and there's a lot more to get to with it. But the one thing that I would love you to kind of go at a little bit, and it goes right back to just even the names that we're getting to. I mean, starting with George Lucas, obviously, who I think I mean, George Lucas is George Lucas, so clearly he has a certain place in the American imagination. Steve Jobs is, as you said, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of reports around a lot of things that make him sound pretty sociopathic, but he also has a brand of being a kind of countercultural innovator in some respects. And there is this whole story of Silicon Valley, I think especially around the time of the crash of Wall Street and the kind of systemic criminality basically of the financial sector. People would look, if they were still looking for a kind of remnant of the market dream in America, it's Silicon Valley. And that's where work is better and more innovative. Companies care about building new things and new industries. There's values beyond just making money. I mean, we really went very deep and I'm not saying that all of that is categorically untrue, but there's definitely a real myth making there that we bought into. And and I think there's something about this story that you're finding in some ways. I mean, that's one of the nicest sectors of the American economy you could be in, is to be an engineer at Google or Apple. And this almost, I mean, the type of collusion you're describing is something like almost out of like the Victorian era or something, with all of this new age wrapping.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, there are a lot of sort of contradictions that come out of Silicon Valley that I think this case is very important in blowing open. One of the contradictions or hypocrisies, or whatever you want to call it, is all of the cant that comes out of the mouths of the Steve Jobs and the Eric Schmidts and all the leaders of Silicon Valley about free market competition, and the value of competition and innovation and all this stuff. I mean, none of these guys would admit that what they think advances their interests and their company's interests are cutting secret, illegal, conspiratorial deals, in back rooms to drive down the workers' wages. It's the opposite. This is supposed to be something new and innovative and meritocratic and so on and so forth. And it's not. And another contradiction, I think, is that the Silicon Valley kind of politics, I initially thought it was just a bunch of, crazy Ron Paul, whatever, libertarianism, but it's actually more paradoxical than that. I think it's it's very Bay Area. So it kind of wants to take the best of 60s liberal countercultural ideas and free market ideals, to get rich and on a kind of idealistic level as well. And you see as wealth accumulates and concentrates in fewer hands, and corporate power concentrates in fewer hands, as is happening in Silicon Valley, that those values, they can't hold together. So what you're seeing is at the very top, at the billionaire board of directors, CEO class, you're seeing them revert to classic old school railroad baron values, and they're doing those things because they're fixing markets. Apple's, fixing prices of ebooks. Apple and all these other companies are fixing their workers' wages levels. They're doing all these things because they have enormous power, and they're not suspected of doing any of this stuff. In fact, people are shocked and generally outraged and hurt because people believe they can't. People
expect this from Wall Street. They don't expect it. Right.
Yeah, and so people, tech workers, a lot of them were very disillusioned and outraged. And, personally, that's what journalism is for, to get people riled up, but over the right thing, to open their eyes to powerful forces that are manipulating their lives. It's certainly one purpose of journalism, I think. And, hopefully this case, and I think it has kind of, broken the cherry that all these kind of starry-eyed techies had, where they didn't even, I think people would rather not think about politics if they don't have to. If they'd rather not think about the contradictions in the Silicon Valley political ethos if they don't have to. Well, now they have to. Now they understand that though they may be better paid than the rest of the workforce, politically, they're manipulated and exploited and as powerless in many ways in relationship to their bosses as victims of wage theft in low-income jobs. And that was a big point I tried to make. And it was, you're right. The tech press largely ignored the story because the tech press in general is accustomed to being a cheerleader section for the tech industry. Right. But the New York Times picked up on it, and that was good. And they picked up, I think, also on what I think is the core, the central story here, which is the politics of this. It's the politics of inequality, the politics of concentrated wealth, concentrated corporate power, and how that screws everybody else, screws the workers.
Yeah, they exactly drew that analogy, and they made the point, which you've also made, that we cannot just say because this. I mean, it's funny. I won't even say that this is in any way self-promoting, because this is a college paper that I would pray nobody ever looks at. But I wrote a paper. I took some. Well, this will be good oppo research for me. So in some Marxism class I took in college, I wrote a paper taking on these theories of wage theft and how they would apply to people who were making incredibly good livings in a place like Silicon Valley. And the point was that the theory still applies even if the conditions are a lot more cushy. Matt is going to ask you a question really briefly, and I think before we get back into the bigger stuff, I think where you want to go is there. You've also disclosed some basically just great kind of color of basically like what Steve Jobs looking like a sociopath looks like. So Matt, go ahead. Go ahead.
You had a piece where, there's an example, a very specific example that you wrote about that shows what happens to, in this case, a Google recruiter who accidentally breaks this illegal contract between these agreement between these tech companies. And I think what happened to this Google recruiter is horrible in itself, but also the reaction from the very highest of these companies is amazing. And if you could just go into that, I think it really adds to this story.
Yeah, that's the thing. When you have that much power and wealth, I don't know, it reminds me of that scene from, I think it was Love and Death by Woody Allen, when he talks about how the battlefield looked to the generals and it was just a bunch of sheep running across the field,
Yeah.
These people, they're very explicit in their depositions as well as in their emails. The billionaires and top CEOs, they see as a very, and I think they're being honest, naturally, the interest of their class, which is a tiny class, they as their own interests. And I think there's another thing that shocked even some investors in Silicon Valley from my stories, from what I heard. They were even willing to put the interest of a Meg Whitman's problems or Steve Jobs' problems over the interest of the shareholders of Google. For example, in the one case where Google shut down a big planned engineering project in Paris, very well-known former Apple people, and they shut it down because Steve Jobs said no. And they had to get his approval first to do it, even though these people didn't work for Apple anymore, and it wouldn't have, impacted him. And as the executive at Google said to the team that they were going to hire in Paris, they said, Steve didn't give a reason why, and he doesn't have to, and we don't expect a reason why from him. He just says no, and that's it. And that's it. Killed it. But in the case that you're talking about, yeah, it was definitely one of the more egregious examples. I spent a lot of time reading through the court docket, so I was able to kind of piece this together. There would always be some violation of the non-solicitation, do not cold call agreement, because on the one hand, Google and everybody is pushing their recruiters to recruit talent constantly, and then on the other hand, they're also trying to make sure they don't violate the agreement, but they're also trying to make sure that not many people know about the agreement. Because as Eric Schmidt said, don't put this in writing. I don't want to get sued. They knew it was illegal. It was clearly illegal.
My personal coach told me to not put this in writing. Sorry, go ahead.
Exactly. So So in this case, a recruiter, hardworking young recruiter from Google, made the fatal mistake of sending some queries, cold call queries, to some Apple engineers. Now, remember as well, and this comes out in the case, from the HR point of view, from the human resources, recruiting point of view, all the best recruiting is done in the industry, and maybe this is true for a lot of industries, but certainly in tech, through cold calling. You'll get Eric Schmidt admitting, everybody from the top down, and saying, yes, obviously, cold calling is how you find talent. They don't like it when somebody goes to them with their resume. They think something's wrong with that person. And you know, their own internal studies show that this is where they get their best talent. So in any event, this young woman makes the mistake of trying to recruit from Apple. Her emails from Google to Apple get forwarded up the ladder, up to Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs then sends it straight to Eric Schmidt and says, you know, do you want to die, basically? Stop this now. Schmidt immediately terrified. And the first thing he and the HR people do before any other actions are done is brutally fire this young woman, and they do so within an hour, and they do so in such a way to make a public example of it. This comes out in the emails. Then they relay back to Jobs that this recruiter has immediately been fired, and they're going to take other steps to make sure it doesn't happen again, and was made a public example of. And then Jobs writes back to then he forwards that to his HR people, and his only response is a little smiley face. And so, you know, this just shows the utter callousness, because I know from talking to people in the case that this young woman, she's since got out of work, but she was destroyed for a couple of years from that whole incident. She was destroyed. And so Steve Jobs just does a smiley face and moves on. And then later in the deposition, when the plaintiff's attorneys were going, recounting that whole story again to Sergey Brin, one of the co-founders of Google, Brin's only response when they sort of walked him through this example of how they fired this recruiter for Steve Jobs, proving illegality, his only response was, "Oh my God, Steve did a smiley. He never did a smiley face for me." And that's how these guys think. And you see this again all up and down, and the worry and desire to take care of each other, take care of each other's interests. I'm talking about the CEOs and the billionaire directors, and not even there's never, you don't ever see anyone worrying or having a conscience about stealing their workers' wages, manipulating them in secret. There's never a worry. There's only a worry for either my friend Meg Whitman or Steve or Sergey, or a worry about getting caught. But there's absolutely zero fealty or concern for what they're doing to their workers.
Because it's a club. I mean, you're in or you're not. And that's the fun. I mean, that just comes across again and again this is incredibly good reporting on this. And then all of these issues that we could talk about, it really comes down to, if you're in the club, it's a concern. If not, smiley face for destroying a young person's career. And that's the thing. I mean, how could she even I'm not going to send that email because I know that will violate my company's organized wage theft criminality. So I won't do. I'm aware of that. I don't want to. I don't want to step out of line. I mean, and that must also explain.
Eric and Sergey brought me into the executive meeting, and told me, even though I'm like one of, God knows, never knew my name or saw me. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
These people are by design are kept out of the conspiracy, and then it's just a little sacrifice to the gods. You sacrifice to the god. The god does a smiley face, and then you get down to the real business of making sure that that the systems are better in place so it doesn't happen again.
Absolutely. So, and this must also explain just this kind of endlessly gobbling up of startups and other things that you see in Silicon Valley, because that's like how you can actually get other people
without breaking this agreement. Yeah,
without breaking the cartel.
One of the things that I heard from other investors. This upset a lot of people in Silicon Valley for a variety of reasons. Tech workers, because they understood there probably is a lot more of this going on, and they just never saw themselves as a potentially exploited workforce. And now they do, and they're pissed off. But also investors. There's how do I put this? Look, these guys are not only trying to drive down wages, they're also doing, again, what early capitalists did when they formed their own sort of secret cartels and so on, which is securing their market dominance in their area of the industry and keeping and making it that much harder for competition to ever threaten them. And that's another story, but certainly when talent, can't move around anymore, or has a harder time moving around, or even knowing what the market's, job market is like, that does hurt startup talent. And also because these guys can't poach each other's employees, they're going to go in and steal, the top talent from tiny startups that are just getting seeded.
Right.
So it violates the Silicon Valley ethos just on so many levels. But it's actually, as you probably figured out when you did your college paper, it's actually textbook capitalism, isn't it?
Right. It doesn't it doesn't violate the ethos of how the market actually works. And I do wonder if people ever sat around though and just wondered to themselves, like, hey, I'm, doing really good here. I kind of wonder at Google. I kind of wonder why I never got a call from Apple. Like in any other sector that happens. It's kind of, I wonder if
lot of people.
Yeah.
A lot of people. I don't know if they're sort of like having real memories or not. I assume they really are, but I was hearing this from a lot of people, both in the both workers and then some investors. All I'm saying, I knew something was odd about what was going on in the job market in that period. I didn't realize, and this thing was much bigger. Look, one of my pieces, I uncovered in the documents, internal secret Google documents. They actually did put it down in writing to try to prevent pissing off Steve Jobs, and have a good system in place. Lists of companies, and even though the core case is really was against 7 firms, Apple, Google, Intel, Adobe, Intuit, Pixar, Lucasfilm, and then eBay separately. What I found on their list were do not call cold call agreements with dozens of companies whose total workforce, well exceeded 1 million people, if indeed that's those agreements were the same as with the core 7, and there's every reason to believe they were. And the DOJ, we investigated this, and we found the DOJ did investigate a lot of these other companies, and in typical DOJ fashion, they went after the best case that they could get. So they went after these 7 companies where the evidence was just overwhelming, and of course, when they settled, the companies did not, and the CEOs did not have to admit to wrongdoing, as is always the case, certainly since the Clinton years. But it did do a good thing in that it at least blew it open. It's a very hard thing to prosecute. Antitrust against a wage theft cartel. Usually antitrust suits, to the extent they even happen anymore, they have to do with fixing prices on goods or services,
right,
but not on fixing workers' wages. That's actually a pretty historical case in that way.
Right.
But I think it was much bigger than even this. That was clear.
So yeah, and I'm going to do right before we wrap up, give a kind of a final status report of where things stand now. But just really briefly, is the reason that Facebook wasn't part of this was because they were sort of still emerging at the point when this was getting established? And then also just parenthetically, I would give anything to watch the Steve Jobs Apple presentation with the black turtleneck explaining the price fixing cartel. That would be, if anybody wants to film and do that, or I'll help write it, I want that to be made. But sorry, go ahead.
I would love to see him do that to all of the the Apple cultists.
Yes.
And to explain why he has to steal their wages
Right.
for innovation and to revolutionize their
We're
lives.
doing something really interesting. You're
Yeah,
not getting a
yeah.
raise or having job mobility. Let me explain.
So,
Here's a death threat I sent to Eric Schmidt. You can see it on my iPhone. I'm just going to call that up and some Bob Dylan. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
exactly. So Facebook, I mean, in a word, Facebook did not get involved because it was not in their interest. I mean, it's pretty much that simple. And you know, Jobs definitely comes out as kind of the almost just over the top cartoonish villain. But there's also a sense I get from reading it, all this and looking at this, that he was conveniently dead. And so, you know, it's pretty clear that Schmidt and Brand and a bunch of the others played up Jobs' villainy in order to make it seem like they were kind of, you know, scared little rabbit victims.
Right.
When they're not. You know, they just were able to conveniently kind of peg it on him. He made me do it, kind of thing. You know.
Right.
So they're all sociopaths in their own way, and having that much wealth does that to you, warps you, and that's why it's got to be ended. So Facebook, Facebook was at the time that Google tried to force. Actually, Google tried to pull a kind of Steve Jobs Nietzschean, you know, we'll go to war with you threat strategy to force Facebook to join up with them and to not recruit each other's employees, because Facebook was poaching a lot of Google's employees in the late 2000s, and Facebook just said no, we're doing great. And you know, Facebook, I think, understood. I mean, the second boom in Silicon Valley was when Google first joined up in 2005. It was just starting to have its new big boom again. By 2008-9, you know, Facebook, I think, understood that their power and that they didn't need to be bullied into an agreement that they didn't want, and so they didn't. And what's interesting is, literally just 1 month after the DOJ's antitrust investigation was announced in 2010, just 1 month later, Google announced that it was giving its entire workforce a 10% raise.
Ah, okay.
They couldn't do it anymore. They couldn't,
Right.
hold on to the agreements. It's just the evidence is so overwhelming in this, because I saw, you know, like Tyler Cowen, the Coke tool, the economist at the Mercatus Center, George Mason.
Right.
He answered my stories by writing that, okay, sure, maybe they did have these secret agreements, but I can prove that actually these secret agreements not to recruit each other's employees actually raised all their workers' wages. And it's a typical libertarian.
No, I mean, I actually proved
Garbage,
that smoking was good for some. Yeah, I mean, right. It's exactly the type of nonsense you'd expect from them.
This illegal agreement actually helped all of our employees' wages, but just as it's getting discovered, we'll just give everyone a 10% raise because we just noticed you're all working so hard. I
Right.
mean,
It's just, it was in a good mood. You know?
Yeah.
It was in a really great mood.
just
The
so-
free market gods just told him, you know, whispered in his ear, 10% rate.
10%.
Yeah, no, it's
10%, guys.
It's infuriating. It's infuriating, and
It's
infuriating to see the tools. But it does show how the current just failure of all of politics and ideologies, and the economy in particular, how all that has made people a lot more receptive to getting outraged over this stuff, and to understanding intuitively like why it's wrong, and to kind of understanding the politics of it. I was surprised to see the New York Times, you know, take pretty much similar view on this as I did, and I think and a lot of others did. And it just shows that this is kind of like it's reached such a big part of the establishment, even that that inequality and concentration of wealth and power is such a giant problem. It just and we're learning new ways in how it's a problem. Like when it's a problem for what's supposed to be the best paid, best treated workforce, you know, in the country, and they are better paid, obviously, than by miles, and better paid than certainly, than minimum wage workers. But even they have no power. And when you realize that, you realize just how screwed up and oligarchical the system has become.
Well, that's as good and as a depressing place to leave as any. But this reporting, which we have linked to on the Majority Report website, is exactly what Mark's saying. It's a great and disturbing and disgusting and outraging and darkly entertaining story in and of itself. But it's a lens through which you can look and really see everything that's taking place today. And that's why it's such an incredibly important thing you're doing. So thanks so much, Mark Ames. Really appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me on.